Hello again. This is Melissa Teitelbaum, go by she, her. I'm a Bachelor of Social Work student at Ryerson University, and I'm also a placement student for a Safer Space. So the book that I'm going to be talking about again today is Hood Feminism by Mikki Kendall. And just a quick reminder of what the book's about. She talks a lot about gaps in today's mainstream feminist movement, who benefits, who's being left out. And she asks us to look at issues such as food security, access to quality education, safe neighborhoods, and medical care as feminist issues. So today I will be focusing on the book's second, third, and fourth chapters. So in chapter two is titled Gun Violence, and some key themes are gun violence. So this is the topic that frames this chapter's discussion as an issue that impacts some women more than others. She talks about domestic violence as an issue connected to and leading up to gun violence, as well as safety, which is put forward as a feminist issue when it is more available to some than others. So in this chapter, Kendall shares personal experiences with gun violence, such as when she came close to getting in the middle of a gunfight between two strangers, but was pulled out of the way by her grandfather. And she asserts that she sees gun violence as a feminist issue, since women in lower income communities come face to face with gun violence on a regular basis. Also, guns in situations of domestic violence lead to more women being killed, and mainstream feminism needs to listen, advocate, and provide resources. As well, law enforcement seems to be indifferent to violence against marginalized people, since crimes in white neighborhoods are less highlighted and covered by the media. This is also something that affects poor white people, but the narrative is that the world is out to get working class white people, while people of color are specifically at fault for their problems. The author also shares that she suffered from PTSD as a result of her experience with gun violence, which includes hypervigilance and anxiety as a response to her trauma. Anti-gun violence programs, she notes, are not focused on the girls and women who are at risk. And Black women also face police violence and death due to police misconduct. So campaigns like Say Her Name and Black Lives Matter are attempting to address this issue at the moment. And she talks about what else can be done. So some things are shifting cultural assumptions about what constitutes safety, making changes to public and private policies to lessen reliance on violence as a solution, listening to victims of intimate partner violence, supporting violence intervention programs at all levels, and seeing gun violence as a systemic issue everywhere, not just systemic in inner city and episodic everywhere else. So she also says that we should treat gun violence as a community health problem and devote resources to addressing it. So an important quote in this chapter on page 28 is, when annoying a new neighbor carries the risk of being shot, question isn't whether gun violence is a feminist issue. The question is why mainstream feminism isn't doing more to address the problem. So this quote highlights the idea that safety is a feminist issue, and when there are areas where some women are less safe than others, feminism is not doing its job of advocating for equality. So in chapter 3, which is entitled Hunger, the key themes are survival. So having access to food is an issue of survival that not all women are facing. And then there's also equity, so which refers to all individuals being treated fairly. So the idea that women suffering from hunger need extra support from privileged feminists now in order to even out the playing field. So in this chapter, Kendall talks about how hunger is often treated as a moral failing, and mothers are judged for having to rely on food banks and stamps. And poverty is treated like a crime, and women who experience it are thought of as making bad choices, even though these so-called good choices are not available to them. She notes that a large percentage of American households struggling with hunger are headed by single mothers, and safety net programs that exist do not take into account the reality of poor women's lives. So women are not given what is needed to escape poverty. Childcare is not recognized as a necessity, and hunger has a lifelong impact that shapes people's relationships with food, health, and the health of their community. Being hungry leads people to make choices that would not otherwise be considered. Survival instincts kick in, and they may have to engage in things like sex work or selling drugs to get by. So real feminism has the compassion to recognize what must be done for the purpose of survival, and it cannot ignore hunger because it is a basic need and not a problem that can be addressed later. There is a need to stop blaming women for food insecurity and making them feel shame, but instead treat it as a societal problem. So there are grassroots initiatives in communities that exist to combat hunger, such as community gardens, food cooperatives, pooling resources, but they're not enough on their own to effectively combat hunger. So more resources and efforts by government are needed. And we cannot rely on private charities to make up this difference. So feminism must deal with issues such as higher prices for fresh foods and insufficient government funding for programs to address hunger on a systemic level. More than ever, we need the support from feminists with privilege and access, and to see food as a human right and as a stepping stone for women to fight for rights and participate in political spaces. So, key quote in this chapter on page 35, alleviating women's poverty is a critical feminist issue. Yet when we talk about hunger and food insecurity, we rarely talk about it in these terms. Why? Because in many mainstream feminist circles, the people talking about these issues don't know what it is to be food insecure in the long term. So this quote underlines critical issues in empathy within the feminist movement that are happening as a result of women who have not experienced certain hardships, such as hunger, not seeing these issues as being critical to all women. And that's a problem that must be overcome. All right, let's move on to chapter 4, which is called Of Fast-Tailed Girls and Freedom. So one major key theme here is respectability politics, which refers to the idea that marginalized peoples must conform to mainstream standards in their behaviors in order to be accepted and seen as respectable. So a fast-tailed girl is someone who is seen to be sexually precocious in some way. This is a hashtag that Nikki Kendall started on Twitter recently and refers to a long history of sexual violence against Black women in America. 40 to 60% of Black American girls being sexually abused before age 18. So these same girls are likely to be labeled as fast-tailed, and the abuse is seen as their fault. Where at the same time, girls may be coming into harm's way because they have no other options, but this is not discussed and the blame is instead put on them. There are many harmful impacts of being exposed to this kind of violence, such as PTSD, depression, anxiety, and substance use. And programming needs to be shifted to focus on healing and health development in girls and young women. As well, unpunished sexual violence is still a threat for Black women and other women of color, and rape culture needs to be challenged at all levels, not just the most visible cases. There is currently a trend of victim blaming. Rape is seen as something that can be prevented by the women who are raped, and there is a myth of white women's purity and every other woman's sexual availability. Currently, 1 in 3 Indigenous women will be victims of sexual assault, and their abuser is most likely to be a white man. So the proper resources here, like culturally competent counselors, shelters, police officers who will not do further harm, are all lacking for people like sex workers, trans women, and women of color. As well, rape is a tool of genocide, and the dynamic of racism and misogyny must be recognized. as there's a history of raping Indigenous women and enslaved Black women with no consequences because they are seen as unrapeable. So this racialized misogyny needs to be addressed, and it also must be addressed that white women are less likely to help victims of assault if they are Black. So this lack of solidarity needs to be looked at more closely. There's also a heightened risk for trans and gender nonconforming people to face sexual violence. And what we can do, Kendall says, to intervene on a personal level is to teach boys about consent and respect, but feminism as a whole must shift focus away from what victims can do to prevent it and towards teaching people not to be predators in the first place. So a key quote here on page 50, for young Black American girls, there is no presumption of innocence by people outside our communities. And too many inside our communities have bought into the victim blaming ideology that respectability will save us, not acknowledging that we are so often targeted regardless of how we behave. The cycle created by racist narratives and perpetuated by the myth of the fast-tailed girl is infinitely harmful and so difficult to break, precisely because of the ugly history of sexual violence against Black women and other women of color. This quote reminds us that the respectability that seems to be expected from women from marginalized groups will not protect them from sexual abuse. It will happen regardless of their behavior because of deep-rooted racism and misogyny, and they will, for these same reasons, be blamed. All right, so that is the end of these 3 chapters. Thank you so much for joining me, and I hope to see you again next week for our discussion of the next few chapters. Thank you so much.